a real fun story.
Yeah. Right. 5:30.
That's a longer story.
So, shall we?
Page in the wheel, right? Okay. Awesome. Absolutely. Awesome. Yeah, we'll converge. Exciting.
Oh, sorry.
So it's best to start. Yes. Okay. Tell her. Let's go this way. I don't want to be on here.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me through the microphone? Yes. Great. Terrific. So I'm John Edwin Mason, and I teach African history and the history of photography at UEA. I'm also a French horn player in the Albemarle County concert band, and we're having a concert coming up in May, so watch out. So before we get started, I'd like to remind you to please turn on your phones when you leave after this event. Be sure to turn your phones back on after the event. So, we're meeting here at the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center, and there can be no more appropriate place for us to be. We're going to be hearing a bit about some dark sides of African American history. And this school is a reminder that there was light within the darkness, that during the era of Jim Crow and before and after, African Americans built vibrant institutions, communities, families, and this very structure is a monument to the creativity, resilience of African Americans. You know, it was built after years of agitation and activism by the black community of Charlottesville. There was no high school for black Charlottesvillians or for black kids from Albemarle County. This school was built in response to demands in the mid-1920s. And the photographs on the walls that surround us are also, in their way, monuments to the creativity of the African American community. I also want to acknowledge that we are meeting here on the unceded lands of the Monacan Nation. We're meeting here on the unceded lands of the Monacan Nation, and you know, that's more than just a platitude. Grace Hale's book, The History of Native Americans in Mississippi, is foundational to Grace's book, and she may say a few words about that. So, let me introduce our speakers. B. Brian Foster is my colleague at the University of Virginia, and we have just met for the first time. I told somebody that I was going to moderate a panel with Brian on it, and she said, "Oh, that's great. He's at UVA." And I said, "Yeah, I'm surprised nobody in the English department introduced us." She said, "No, he's in sociology." And I said, "Oh, wait a minute. I've just read his essays in this fantastic book, and I had no idea that a sociologist could write like that." No, it's beautiful, beautiful prose. And in fact, one of my very first questions is going to be to ask Brian about his writing process. He's got a great quote about his own prose, and I'll read that later. Brian has a PhD in sociology from the University of North Carolina, and as I said, is currently here as an associate professor of sociology at the University of Virginia. He has an award-winning book that was relatively recently published called I Don't Like the Blues, which is a great title for a book. It's about his work in Clarksdale, Mississippi, and I definitely urge you to read it. But before that, you can read his essay about Clarksdale that's in the book we'll be discussing today. It's really fantastic. He is a filmmaker, among other things, and a writer for a number of publications, including CNN, Esquire, The Washington Post, Bitter Southerner, etc., and so on. So, Brian, it's great to meet you.
Good to meet you. Thank you for that.
So, I met Grace Hale sometime in the late 19th century when we both came to the University of Virginia.
Just after Jefferson died. Brian wasn't born yet.
Yeah, Grace and I have known each other for a long time, but you know, the thing is that when you're colleagues and you run into each other frequently in the mailroom.
John, could you speak a little more into the mic? It's harder to hear you than Grace.
Yeah, okay. We had a little bit of feedback earlier.
Oh, sorry.
Trying to avoid that. When you run into a colleague in the hallways or in the mailroom on a regular basis, you don't often start a conversation by saying, "Grace, I really love your writing and I've learned a lot from it." It's just, you don't say that, but I want to say it. Grace, I love your writing and I've learned a lot from it. Grace is one of those very unusual people who is a fantastic historian, and I'm going to ask her about her process in writing history. But she also writes with the flair, the skill, the beauty, the lyricism of a novelist. It's immensely evocative prose. It's humbling also to read, but I really love it, Grace. It's not just me who will say these kinds of things. Grace has a list of awards and honors for her historical writing that is as long as my arm. You know, in some ways, Grace is an old-fashioned historian. And I don't mean that, Grace, in the sense that you're not innovative, because she is. Trailblazing, innovative, all of those things. You know, looking at different topics. She's innovative in the terms of the topics that she looks at. She's innovative in terms of the kinds of historical materials she used to tell her story. But she's old-fashioned in that she's writing history as literature. And in the 19th century, it was common. Into the 20th century, common to think of history as literature. So, Grace, I'm glad you're through it.
Thanks so much, John. I'm really blushing over here. I don't know if the lighting is showing it from that introduction. Thank you, John.
It's all true. I want to start by asking both of you to talk about your books. And because I think most people in the audience here haven't had a chance to read these books or to thumb through them. They will be on sale over in the room behind us right after this event, so be sure to stop by and get an autographed copy. But they won't have had a chance to read these books or to look through them. So I'd like to ask you just simply to give an overview, an introduction to the audience to your books. And Brian, why don't we start with you?
Sure. The name of the book is Ghosts of Segregation, American Racism, Hidden in Plain Sight. You might call it a photo documentary book, or I call it a photo essay collection. It's a collaborative project with a photographer based in Washington State, born in Chicago, Richard Frischman. The project includes 129 photos taken in about 40 states across the country, photos showing various vestiges, landscapes, buildings, bridges that evoke in some way or another the nation's racial history. So there's a photo of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, evoking the history of Bloody Sunday. There's a photo of these are heavy histories, right? There's a photo of the barn where Emmett Till was beaten and killed, and a photo of the bridge where it said that his body was thrown over into the Tallahatchie River. There are photos of the former colored entrances of various business establishments. So for example, theaters. There are sites where men and women and children were lynched. There are, many of us will be familiar with the names like Trayvon Martin, some of the more recent, Michael Brown, some of the more recent instances of what some of us call Black Death. So various sites that evoke the nation's racial history. One word about the photos. Rich has, for my money, like a very interesting and I would say important approach to his work. It's not unique. He didn't pioneer it. If for folks into photography, you'll be familiar. It's called stitching, wherein he will take a photo, actually imagine that the window pane, one of these window panes, is an image, and Rich's approach is to, for each pane, take a photo of sort of individual frames of the larger image. So if the window is an image, he's actually taken 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18 separate photos that he then edits together. Why does he do that? He calls the photos evidence. And it's important for him that the evidence is as detailed as possible. And so this approach allows, for pristine clarity, if you're looking at it on your phone, obviously, but also if it were projected on the wall. So, sort of the detail holds at various scales. For my part, I add 7 essays that respond to, in some ways, many of the photos, and then essays that kind of stray away and do their own thing. I guess there's that southern accent that comes out. I talk about some field work that I've done in Mississippi. I visit many of the sites in the collection, so I talk about, for example, my time in New Orleans, my time in southern Mississippi, and there's a lot about sort of family history, a quest for as much information as I can find about kind of my own lineage, so how far can I go back to sort of learn about the story of my family's time here, and other things that will come up in the conversation. But again, yeah, it's Ghosts of Segregation, American Racism, Hidden in Plain Sight. And, again, things that'll come up, I see it as a part of a tradition of collaborative work between photographers and documentarians and artists, writers, poets. Sometimes, I write sort of within the Black radical tradition, so I'm in response to conversations that Black scholars and writers are having. But in many cases, these collaborations do cross. Rich is a Jewish man, Rich is a white Jewish man, and there's a tradition of those sorts of kind of collaborations that we would locate the project as a part of. So that's a little bit about it. I think that's enough to kind of to set the parameters for the conversation.
Well, Grace, before you start, I did want to say that the photographs in the book, The Ghost of Segregation, are not simply from the South. Most are from the South, but some are from the North, and 2 are from Charlottesville. 2 are from Miami. Grace?
Well, I just want to say it's great to be on this panel with Brian because I read his book as part of my research before he was my colleague here, and I feel like there's a coming full circle. And he also agreed to read part of this manuscript in a messy draft, and so I'm forever indebted. But this book, In the Pines, is really my attempt to write a sort of multi-genre book. It's in some ways an intimate family story with a touch of memoir. It's also a true crime tale, and it's a history of a little-known black community that flourished in the deep South in a place called Jefferson Davis County. And like most histories, it starts with a story. Now, the first version of this story that I heard, I was in college and I was home visiting, and my mom told me a story about her father that was just straight out of To Kill a Mockingbird, you know, the classic Atticus Finch tale. And I won't go into elaborate detail, it's in the book, but in her version of the story, my grandfather spent the night at the jail with his gun protecting a black prisoner, and he was a hero in that version of the story. He's very much a hero. Now, my grandfather was dead by the time I heard this story, but he was actually the person that made me want to be a historian. It's a cliche when we read graduate apps, when people write about grandpa or grandma teaching them to love history, and we always laugh amongst ourselves and say, oh, that's just a dumb thing to write on your graduate essay, but I'm here to tell you, maybe don't repeat it to my colleagues, except for John will keep it quiet, but that is definitely the case with me. My grandfather was a person that really taught me to love history. His storytelling about the place about Jeff Davis County really drew me into history. So when I heard that story, I was just absolutely floored by it. It's a lot of the reason why I went to graduate school to get a PhD in US history, and why studying lynching was at the center of my dissertation. Now, when I was in grad school, I went to visit my grandmother, and in that way that some grad students, at least I was like this as a grad student, you know, you learn a little bit and you don't know what you don't know. So I was a little full of myself and my new research skills, and I thought, oh, I'm gonna go over there and I'm gonna talk to my grandmother and I'm gonna do research and find out about this story about my grandfather. That didn't go as well as I'd hoped. My grandmother didn't want to talk about it. We can go into the reasons why. They're complex, more complex than it may seem on the surface. So I went down to the local newspaper office and thought, okay, the newspaper has to have reported on this. I'm going to find it. Lucky for me, it was a weekly because I didn't have a date, but I managed after spending the day there to find an article, and it was a different story than my grandmother had told me. I did learn a few things like the date, August 1st, 1947, this had happened, and I learned the name of the black man who was in the jail and was subsequently killed, Versi Johnson. But it was reading that story that I realized that the story in the newspaper was a lie. There were sort of telltale signs that I'd learned to see by reading Ida B. Wells, Du Bois, the NAACP reports on lynching. There were telltale signs that the people were lying in the newspaper, and that also made me realize that my family story was also a lie. And the most important one of those details was that Versi Johnson, a black man there in a jail in Mississippi, had asked to be taken out into the countryside to the alleged scene of the crime so he could describe what happened. Now, no black man asked to be taken out of a jail in prime lynching territory in 1947. There's a reason that Mississippi in the 30s built a jail on top of the courthouse for the county where Jackson is located, 5-6 stories up in the sky. There's a reason they built that jail they advertised as a mob-proof jail. So that made me realize that the story I grew up with was a lie, the story in the paper was a lie, and I'm really embarrassed and deeply embarrassed to say that that's where I left it in the mid-1990s, because I didn't really have the courage to look any deeper. I didn't want to upset my grandmother, I'm named after her, didn't want to upset my mom, my other relatives, and that's where I left it. And I wouldn't have written this book at all if it wasn't for 2017 in Charlottesville. Now, I feel like some of you are Charlottesvillians. I know some of the people in the audience. I don't have to tell you what happened there. But I was left in just great despair after those events as somebody who had been teaching Southern history for 20+ years at that point, who had been who had been working, to sort of get the real history of the South and of the U.S. for that matter, and of white supremacy in the U.S. out there. It just seemed to me that, why were these lies still, able to stand as truth? Why did so many people believe things about the past that weren't true? And that's when it dawned on me that my own family had this lie at the center of our history, and that I had been too afraid to look into the truth. And so there's a deep irony at the center of this book, and that is that my grandfather taught me to love history, and then I turned around and used those skills to unmask what he did across his multiple terms as sheriff of Jeff Davis County. I'm not going to tell you what I found out about what actually happened. This book is written there's a narrative suspense in the story. But I wanted to just say briefly that there are three main characters. There's my grandfather, Ori Berry. There's Versi Johnson, whose history I did everything I could to resurrect. Obviously, nothing I could do would change what happened to him as a human being, but I felt like, as a historian, I could tell his history. And then finally, the final piece of the final character is really this place, Jeff Davis County, and particularly a flourishing community of black farmers in this place. I believe that many, many Americans don't, unless you have people in your family that are from this region, people don't really realize that despite the horrors of Jim Crow and lynching, there were flourishing black rural communities across the South, and especially in the Deep South. In a place like Jeff Davis County, which is the piney woods, the land wasn't very expensive. There's a lot of reasons why this is the case, which I could go into if people want to ask, but a lot of black families owned land there, over 300 black farming families in a very rural place. Some of these farms are over 1,000 acres. They also managed to found their own school, modeled on the Tuskegee Institute, that provides everything from elementary and high school education to junior college, vo-tech, teacher training, minister training, etc. And then, of course, they have that rich network of rural black churches, which is common across the South. But I wanted to tell the story of this community because when Versi Johnson is killed in this incident, of course it is a trauma and a tragedy for his family, but it is also an attack on this whole community of people. And I wanted to tell that story as well. And then the rest of the book really brings us up to date about what happens in the wake of this killing and a kind of white backlash against this independent black farming community, and how over time white people in this place really dismantle all of the sort of public resources that they had formerly bragged about rather than share them with their black neighbors. And so I bring it all the way up to the present. I've probably gone over my allotted time, so I'll stop there.
No, it's actually really fascinating, Grace. And having read the book, I think you're underselling it. Because it really works on at least two different levels. It's really good history, but it's a true crime story, and you have to read to the very end. You do. You have to read to the very end.
There are lots of crimes, let's put it that way. There's the one that is obvious, and there are others.
But you do have to read to the very end. She withholds things. Okay, so I want to ask some questions about these books, right? And I think the question that I was thinking, I've got a couple of questions I think came most strongly to my mind, but one is the why now? And so Grace, you talked a little bit about why now for you. Brian, why now? Why this book? Why now?
Yeah, I'll talk. There are many different directions that I could take this. I kind of want to think about the approach that I took to the essays, which is a more personal approach. Each of the photos includes a pretty detailed caption in terms of the who's, the what's, the whens, the where's. Sorry, I'm trying to talk into the mic consistently. And so I didn't want to just replicate that. And I didn't, for a minute, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. They said, hey, you've got 20,000 words, do with them as you will. And the first essay in the collection really sort of gets at the approach that I ended up taking, which is to turn the lens, in a more personal direction. I talk about my relationship with my grandmother, And, you know, in a parallel way to what we just heard from Grace, my grandmother taught me, she taught, you know, I say she taught me to be an archivist. A keeper is the language that I use. I grew up right next door to her, and in the summer times, I would spend every day that I could with her. She's the person I wanted to grow up to be like. And I watched her on Saturday mornings take out all of these photo albums that show my family and all of our different shapes and sizes and colors. And I watched how serious she was about it, how serious she was when she peeled the plastic back and would hold some of the photos up and ask me, do you remember who this is and where that was and when this was and so forth. And beginning in 2020, around the same time that I was asked if I was interested in joining the collection, my grandmother passed in 2008, so I had inherited all of these photo albums and all of the other whatnots that she had kept. And so I get this invitation about ghosts of segregation at the same time that I've decided, it's the pandemic, that I'm gonna organize all of the pictures. I want to put all of the ones from the family reunion in 1982 together in 1983 and 1994, and I want to put all, so forth and so on. And so there was kind of a merger between the archival work that Rich had been doing. He had started working on the photographic component of the collection in 2016. And, you know, I'll speak for him. His answer to the why question would point to the various ways, especially as we inch closer to summer of 2020, when the collection is starting to take its final form. He would point to the various ways that these racial histories are being obfuscated or lied about or imagined as not having existed. He would point to the work of the photos as documenting histories that happened, documenting the evidence that could be erased. There are many of the sites in the collection that burned down. For example, there's a church in Oxford, Mississippi. He has a shot of the entrance that black parishioners would have to take. They would have to climb a ladder and enter onto a little kind of narrow balcony and watch the service from there. And the church, maybe about 7 or 8 months after he took the photo, it burned down. And so Rich would talk about the importance of documenting these histories that, you know, in various ways, whether discursively, ideologically, are being obfuscated and kind of imagined away, or in literal ways, the kind of architectural and physical evidence are wasting away or being destroyed. And so I am watching and admiring, I should say, this archival work that Rich is doing, and becoming increasingly interested in doing a type of archival work myself. And so, that's maybe a clunky way, and there's a much bigger story to talk about the why and the why now. But for me, I saw virtue in Rich's approach. I saw responsibility, the same responsibility that I watched my grandmother instill in me on Saturday mornings with the photo albums and all of the other whatnots of my family's history. I saw that in Rich's work and appreciated it. And so, the why in terms of the collection itself, we're at a time where, it's a weird and funny time where things that actually happened are imagined as not having happened. And for me, a book of evidence, a book of vivid, and in some cases, gorgeous and beautiful photos that evoke these terrible and frightening histories, for me is a timely addition to a massive literature that I think can kind of combat these efforts to obfuscate. And then there's that personal side. There's the kind of this interest in putting as many stories, as I often say, of the rural Black South. In this case, stories of my family, or stories of the people and communities that I spend time in doing field work, the focus of my research and writing, putting as many of those stories on the record as possible, in some cases for similar reasons, so that those stories can't be forgotten and obfuscated, but also because, and this will, at some point we'll talk about the writing, because for me there is a beauty. Even in these terrible and ugly histories, there is a beauty. And I could go on and on, but that's what I'll say now. So it's a mixture of, I think, reasons, personal, political, micro, and macro.
Well, I'm going to ask you to go on and on for a second here, because you just mentioned the writing. I want to read something to you that you wrote. I did not want to write something regular and flat. I wanted to write something that compels you to move. I wanted to write a blues, a collection of uniquely shaped things that follow some rules and break others, that move on their own and together, that sometimes clash and sometimes blend, that all the time make us feel. Could you riff on that for a little bit? That's an incredibly evocative passage, and it really struck me.
I didn't really know what to, we got all of these photos and they want me to write something. And we've got the captions, so I don't need to tell the stories that are present in the photos. So what do I do? Folks call me a poet. I don't call myself that, but that does, I think, match the typical way, the kind of tenor and the rhythm, I guess, with which that I write. And so I wanted to keep that kind of poetic character. I wanted the words themselves to be artful. I wanted the words themselves I tell my students, I don't have a technology policy in my classes. It's my job to get and keep your attention. And when I have it, it's my job to make sure I drop all of the information that I want you to have, to make sure I drop it inside of that attention so that when you leave, you can remember some things, and getting into the point of kind of the language that you just read, which I appreciate, so that you feel something inside of you that makes you want to do something with the information that I have deposited. And so it's a similar idea. I wanted to write something that would capture some folks' attention. And while I have the attention in the, 2,000 or 3,000 words, thinking about the lengths of the essays, that I have your attention, let me make sure I give you some information, but not just like information. Let me make sure I give you some information that will do something. I hope you read something that makes you uncomfortable a little bit. I don't know what you might do with that discomfort, but I hope it makes you or angry or maybe emotional. And for me, it's about, I want to keep your attention here because I feel like these are stories and histories that are worthwhile, that are worthy. And I know that, it's a photo book. It's not a typical, there's so many elements of the book that don't really motivate close reading, right? I think we may talk about photo books or photo documentary projects at some point. There are many elements of the book that may not invite a close read. And so I think the style of the writing is, at least I wrote with that in mind. And again, I'll say again, I could go on and on about kind of the histories and traditions of writing that I locate myself in. I'm a black boy from Mississippi. There is a rich tradition, Richard Wright and Kiese Layman and Jesmyn Ward, there's a rich tradition of black writers from Mississippi who approach the craft in a particular way, and who have influenced kind of the voice that I have. I'm a sociologist. That informs how I do what I do, but it don't inform how I write about it. The writing is informed by these other literary traditions that that I'm trying to kind of evoke and honor with that sort of language.
Hey, Grace, we're going to talk about writing.
Great.
And the thing that strikes me about your writing is how visual it is. So I had to read the Kindle edition of your book because I need larger type. And the Kindle version doesn't have any photos in it at all. So I don't know if you have any photos in the regular edition, but you don't need them because your text is so visually evocative of landscape, of institutions, of individuals that, I had like a movie going in my mind throughout that. And I want to ask you first, how conscious are you of writing in that way? And are you consciously sort of visualizing the history that you're telling?
Thank you. That's a great question. And Yes, there are pictures, and I'll have to get you the pictures. But I really wanted readers to enter the space of the rural South. So some people may have been to parts of the rural South today, but the place that I was talking about changed a great deal over the course of the time that I was talking about it, over the 20th century. So even if you have been in these spaces today, you might not have been in those spaces in the past, right? And so I wanted to make that real for people. I think a lot of Americans today don't understand rural America at all and don't really know its history or know what it's like. It's one of the things that really drew me to Brian's work before I met him. Because he was doing such smart, sophisticated work about the rural South. But I really tried to make that come alive. One thing that really helps me as a writer is that I live with a photographer. My husband is an artist and a photography professor at UVA, and I spend a lot of time with him and other photographers, and I hear them talk about what makes a picture compelling to them, why they would frame it in a certain way, compose a shot in a certain way, think about a certain angle of vision, and I really tried to bring that to my writing, if that makes sense. And I also looked at lots of historic photographs. Lucky for me, in the age of digitalization, there were lots of photographs of not my actual place of Jeff Davis County, but the southern piney woods, and I spent a lot of time looking at those photographs. I wanted you to feel like you were there. And I found that concrete details did that for me, and I hope for readers. So if I'm going to talk about a place, I want to tell you what kind of trees are there, not just that they're pine trees, what kind of pine trees. What if there's a stream, what kind of fish are in that stream? And so I spent a huge amount of time on state encyclopedias, not Virginia's, but I see Matthew Gibson's in the back. Thank you for that. I know long ago you worked on that project and still oversee it in ways. Those are great places for writers to find out, okay, if I'm going to talk about fish, what kind of fish are they? So I use the heck out of those kinds of resources. But I really think photographers taught me to think about what I call the telling detail, and I really tried to do that through prose.
If I can just jump in real quick, so much of my work focuses on place. So much of my research as a sociologist focuses on place. I'm teaching a course right now where the primary focus is Black placemaking, and what I teach in the class, and you find this in the literature. So I'll say first, there's a tendency among social scientists to treat place as just like the backdrop, as the background thing, not super, it matters. We need to know where we are, for example, but it's not given the kind of, or the dynamism, the ways in which place shapes social life are not acknowledged a lot in social science research. And so I just remember reading the early draft that you mentioned, and I think I may have made a comment about how much I appreciated the very detailed and I think vivid sort of what am I trying to say? The detailed way in which you talk about literally the lay of the land. Because the lay of the land, it's a part of the story. If you're writing about race in the rural South, if you're writing about the rural South in general, the details of the environment are important. And so just to say, I remember being very struck in a similar way by your treatment and kind of description of place and effort to do the same thing, not only in my writing, but in how I teach about social science research as it relates to race and Black communities, which is what I study. So.
Yeah, thanks for that. I just really felt like it had to be there. I just wanted people to be able to see it in their mind. Yeah.
I want to ask you both. Sorry. I want to ask you both about swimming pools. Swimming pool is very important at the very end of Grace's book, and swimming pools are important periodically throughout the book that goes to segregation. So by swimming pools, I mean swimming pools that don't exist anymore. Swimming pools that have either been filled in with concrete or gravel, or swimming pools that have been just completely destroyed. And so I'm going to start with you, Grace. I'm going to start with you helping us think through what we learn when we learn about that destruction of a swimming pool. And you know, your book, it's about a tragic incident, but in some ways it's a small incident, and it's about a small place. But once you start talking about the swimming pool, you're clearly opening it up to a much broader conversation about this country, not just about Prentiss, Mississippi.
So one of the things I really wanted to talk about was in the aftermath of Mercy Johnson's killing, how white people sort of woke up and realized there was a successful black community in their midst, and those black folks became more active. They founded an NAACP chapter. They started petitioning for their share of education funds, etc. And in response to that, white people got nastier and nastier. And I think really what John is referring to is sort of by the 1950s, you see white folks in Jeff Davis County, and one of the great things about a small place is you can see it play out, right? It's a story that's playing out so many places in America, but I've got this really finite stage, and so I can really show you how it plays out. So this is a place that has bragged about building infrastructure, building public resources for its people. It's not a very rich part. I mean, Mississippi is the poorest state, and this is a poor part of Mississippi. But over time, they are able to build, nice school buildings, and even build a pool, a swimming pool right behind the high school and the elementary school.
The white high school.
The white high school and the white elementary school. In contrast, the Prentiss Institute, this black private educational institution, is running the only black high school in the county until after the Brown decision. So that is the kind of trade-off. But I wanted to show how after the sort of mass movement phase of the civil rights movement, white Southerners really turn against their own interests. They dismantle all of these things that they have spent all of these decades acquiring rather than share them with their black neighbors. And the pool is just so wonderfully evocative of that. When they're finally forced in 1970 to integrate the high school, they of course just fill in the pool. Because even though at the same moment they're starting a segregation academy, so their kids are going to go to the Christian school, heaven forbid they leave the pool behind, right? And that is in some ways the most sort of cinematic example, but you see that played out in every possible aspect of sort of publicly funded things, libraries, public buildings like the courthouse, the city hall, and how they're kept up, every sort of aspect of public space. It's not a coincidence that white Southerners turn against public funding of resources and the government and become Republicans in this moment, right? It is not a coincidence. They do not want to share what they have with their black neighbors, and that makes them very prone to be enticed to join a political party that thinks that government's always bad, right? And so I think that is in itself a crime. And I had a small canvas, right? So I could show how that played out in that space.
And Brian, I know you've been thinking about this on a larger scale.
Yeah, so one of the essays in the collection recounts kind of bits and pieces of my time in Clarksdale, Mississippi, a town in the northern part of the Mississippi Delta, so think like northwest Mississippi. Just for context, it's a place known for the blues capital of the world. Hundreds of thousands of folks year-round visit Clarksdale for the blues festivals and museums and so forth. And the history that Grace just recounted it's kind of point by point what plays out in Clarksdale. There's a public swimming pool that is in front of the white high school. And at the moment where black folks gain access to the pool and other public accommodations in town, they literally fill it with concrete. And so as as a sidebar, there's a photo of what used to be the public swimming pool in the collection. There's another pool in Baltimore, Maryland, with a similar history, a photo of that pool, or what used to be that pool, also in the collection. But I'll say this one thing, just kind of a different angle. A lot of my work, especially in the Clarksdale project that I've been talking about, deals with what I call social epistemologies or racial epistemologies. So epistemology is like, how do you know what you know? How do you prove that what you say you know is true? So it's like proof and truth and knowledge. So how do you, and I'm especially interested in how Black Southerners, or what Black Southerners claim to know about race, what we claim to know about white folks, what we claim to know about racism, and what we point to as proof of said knowledge. What I found in Clarksdale, and this won't be, maybe this will or won't be kind of illuminating, it's pretty straightforward, is that the racial epistemologies of Black folks in Clarksdale, and I argue by extension Black Southerners, are rooted in a few different sorts of like sensory phenomena. I don't know, it's a better word for that. What people see, what people experience, and the telling of stories about what folks experience, and then it's kind of tautological, but it's also about what people claim to know. And when you listen closely to what folks claim to know about the racial history of Clarksdale, they oftentimes will point to, literally or figuratively, the environment. They will say, the downtown square in Clarksdale used to be a place that if I was there after a certain time, something bad would happen to me. That is how I know that that is not a place that I want to be. Like, that's how I know that that's not a place that's meant for me. The Fielding swimming pool is a place in Clarksdale that folks, not just a few, it's patterned, that folks point to as proof of not just a particular racial history that is uncomfortable or violent or so forth towards local Black people, but also of a specific racial present that they see as not too far removed from that history. And so I think I squared the circle there. The point is, the pool is an example of, and there are other examples that I could pull from in my work in Clarksdale. The pool is an example of how place becomes inscribed in memory, and how memory becomes inscribed in what people do and don't do, actions and behaviors.
So, we've been going for quite a while, and you guys haven't said a word. And so, I want you to say a few words. So we're going to open this up to a Q&A. And while you are thinking of your questions, let me give a shout out to Rich Frischman's photographs in Ghost of Segregation. They are extraordinary photographs, and they work on several different levels. They are, first of all, very beautiful. And it's a funny thing to say that these are beautiful photographs of really ugliness, right? These are beautiful photographs of segregation, of places of exclusion, of sometimes places of death. Yet their beauty draws you in. And once you start getting drawn into these photographs, you start seeing their complexity and their layers. You know, we're used to, I think Gracie used the phrase close reading a while back, and we're used to closely reading text, right? So that if we're reading some sociology, or if we're reading a poem, we know we have to really pay attention to what we're doing. We rarely do this with photographs, unless you're a professional writer or photographer, writer about photography or photographer. But these really do require patience, you know, that I would approach Frischman's photographs as if I were reading a poem, because they are very layered, very complex, and they really reward your time. So, I have to ask the people in the back, is there a microphone for people asking questions? Okay, great. Saw you first.
Thank you, this has really been fun. I'm really curious about the collaboration of how you connected with Rich, and it sounds like there are other people who also wrote in that, and how that whole team got together and what that process has been like.
Yeah, thank you for that, and thank you for your attention throughout our conversation so far. The Rich began what has become this book in 2016 with just a couple of pictures, both in Texas. The details, would maybe take a little bit more time than I want to give, but started in 2016, but didn't really pick up steam for a couple years until 2018-ish. And around 2018, 2019, the collection, so separate from, I've not entered the picture yet, it starts to get a little bit of attention, and including from publishers. Hey, this can be maybe some sort of photo book. In 2020, Rich writes a feature essay that appears in the Times, New York Times, Hidden in Plain Sight, as a sidebar, which I read, and I take a lot of interest in the project, but not from the perspective of perhaps joining it, which I do about a year later. Just, this is really parallel to how I think about place and race and history and memory. And so now fast forward, I get a call from his agent. Hey, we're looking for a writer. Here's the project. Here's the person. Rich and I, from that point forward, have a bunch of conversations. He's interested in my intentions. He's interested in how I might approach the project, my part of the project. I'm interested. I say this often. I always preface it by saying I don't mean no harm, but when some white folks come to me talking about doing something that relates to Black American history, I'm typically a little skeptical, and that was absolutely the case with this project. And what I said earlier, I mean. My grandmother taught me to approach the work that I do with seriousness, for better or for worse. And for me, that is what I was looking for. Serious, defined in maybe a nuanced way, but also in a straightforward way. I think we're all on the same page. And this is what I saw enough of and heard enough of in Rich, a seriousness, a responsibility, an empathy, a care, a knowledge of history. And so we have a bunch of conversations, and from there forward, it's a very kind of iterative process. I don't know if there's maybe a better word, but I was very interested in his perspective in terms of what could be, what could be added with text, what could I add, and he was interested in any ideas I might have about locations that he could photograph. And so we worked as a pair from 2021, for a couple of years we worked, kind of continuing to build the project before we even got to the point of polishing. And yeah, I would just say, it worked. He was always open to critique and questioning. He was always open to suggestions, and vice versa. I was always interested in, wanting the project to feel coherent, wanting the project not to feel like a photographer took some pictures and a writer wrote some essays. Maybe it kind of feels like that. I don't think so. Or even if it does, I wanted there to be a third way that folks encountered it, and it was kind of as the sum of its parts, as this dynamic, oddly shaped, I don't really know what to do with it, but it has a feel to it that is appealing project. And I do think that we accomplished that kind of third dynamic, and I think, and I would just point to some of the things that I mentioned about the openness and kind of care, especially that he brought to the project. And I'll say quickly, we've got a foreword from Dr. Monty Perry, National Book Award winner, Genius Grant recipient, and who just so generously offered, not just her name, but her voice and perspective, which I appreciate. And I think because the project is also very evocative and kind of parallel to her work as well.
I saw a hand over here. I can't remember which one it was. While the microphone is going back to you, we'll just say that the collaboration really works. And you know, in any kind of picture book, you go to the pictures first, and that's what I did. I went to the pictures first. And you notice, among other things, that they're no people. And then you start reading the essays, and they're the people. It's really remarkable how that works. And of course, you know, Frischman wanted to create documents which are almost necessarily a bit removed, right? A bit analytical. And where's the flesh and blood? Flesh and blood is in the essays. The warmth, the humanity, the love, the passion. Yeah, it's great. Very well.
I'm just wondering what each of you envision or would favor in terms of how to memorialize places in different towns. Like I'm thinking of places I didn't grow up here that people have told me about. Like there's some fast food place on High Street that there's a place that like it's oddly designed, and I went there a million times before someone told me that's because that used to be the black entrance and that was the white entrance. Like it'd be really cool to have a sign, but just what each of you think would be best in that way. Not at that particular business, but in general.
Well, I think this is a tough question because people in rural America, and I don't mean Charlottesville horse farm rural, you know, I don't mean that rural, I mean the other rural, right? People in Charlottesville always think, oh, the rural, people are rich out there. No, that's not what I mean. The places that I have been working in the last like 10 years in my research, people are so desperately in need of economic development that this is so down the list for them, way down the list of concerns. And while the historian in me wants preservation always, I think that it is important to listen to people that live in a place and what they feel like they need. And this does not cover everywhere, but in the places that I have been researching for this book and for a new project that I'm working on, people are, this is far from their concerns. Their level of need is so great that there's so many small towns in America that can't pave the roads, that can't, you know, the water crisis in Jackson gets a lot of news, but there's water crises in small towns all over America. Their infrastructure is completely crumbling. They have no tax base. They can't keep the lawns mowed. I mean, it is really desperate. And so I only say that in humility because as a historian, I'm like, let's preserve, let's memorialize, let's commemorate. But I think that there is a way that could be just yet another version of outsiders coming in and telling people what they need. Maybe not in Charlottesville, but in some other places that I've been working. And I want us to ask them what they want, if that makes sense. All the communities in those places, not, of course, letting a certain formerly empowered white community make those decisions, but all the people. And I'm not sure that historic preservation is high on the list for some folks, but I'm going to defer to Brian.
I'm just going to echo you a little bit. I do a lot of oral history work, which is sort of an offshoot, I would say, of kind of the kind of preservation and commemoration work that I think you're referencing. And I would say, one, people are eager to talk about histories. People are eager to, I would say that people are eager for a certain recognition of, you know, this building was used for XYZ. Like, there is an eagerness to share those stories, but without fail, those stories are always tied to contemporary issues and concerns and needs. And so I think maybe the way to approach and answer any effort towards commemoration and preservation, I think, must also attend to people's desires in general. To your point, what do people say that they need? But more generally, I think any attempts at preservation and commemoration should be attached to real efforts on the part of the commemorators and preservers to address material conditions today. So, you know, I think that's approaching an answer, but really echoing what I wanted to sort of share.
I mean, in Prentiss, Mississippi, Jeff Davis County is a black majority county, always has been. And Prentiss is now a black town. And they just want to keep the lights on. They want to keep the water working. They want to, their interests are there. So I think we as a country, we're a rich nation. We really need to think about investing in rural America in all sorts of ways, and then helping them to preserve the histories that they're interested in.
I think quite a few of you know that I served on the city's Blue Ribbon Commission that made recommendations to City Council about what to do with the Lee and Jefferson statues. And you know what Grace and Brian are describing is also part of Charlottesville. That when we talk to members of the African American community here, they say, well, yeah, I mean, if you want to get rid of those statues, fine, but we can't afford to live here anymore. And our children can't get decent jobs, and they move out of town. So those materials concerns are very, very present. As far as memorializing, the memorials that have moved me the most in the last few years are the people's memorials, the ones that come from the bottom up. And I think about the memorial to Heather Heyer downtown. I think about the way that people have added to the memorialization of the slave auction site. And I think of the magnificent transformation of the pedestal of the Lee statue in Richmond. I'm really sorry they took that down, because while it stood and while that area around the pedestal was turned into a people's park, that was an incredibly moving memorial, and it came from the bottom up. It didn't come from the top down. All of these came from the bottom up, not the top.
Can I say one other thing? I mean, Brian and I have both done this kind of work, but one of the most important things academics can do, and some people are doing, is to help communities preserve their own histories how they want to. There's a concept of archiving in place, collecting oral histories, providing what we know as scholars to communities so that they can collect their own materials. We can help them do oral histories if they want that. We can help advise about preservation of those materials and digitization, but then they're keeping those histories in their own communities. And I think that's really the best model for an institution like UVA to use with the small towns that aren't in horse country, but that are all around us.
I'm just so grateful. Today I'm a folklorist, but Brian, I was a journalist in Mississippi in the 1970s. And you all have brought together this dismantling of infrastructure with the centrality of place in a way that is, I'm thinking, Vinegar Hill. And here we sit. That's just, thank you for making that kind of, the two of you together did that. Thank you.
Well, your point is a great one. The community here wanted this building preserved, and they worked for years and years and years to make it a reality, and so that's why we're here, right?
I think the microphone's coming.
Thank you. Question for either or both authors. Has your work allowed you to discover methods that ordinary people who lack your literary skills can use to enlighten those individuals who seem so adamantly resistant to learning or accepting the truth?
Probably not. I think, I was going to say a little.
No, I was just signaling to the that's all.
I think it would be, I would appreciate if one of these folks who are adamant, I think that language is important, like who insist on not learning or, not confronting difficult histories. I would appreciate it if those folks encountered this collection or a conversation about it, and it did nudge them in, towards, a broader understanding. I've been, I'm young. I've talked to too many. Like, if somebody don't want to believe something, I don't know. They probably not gonna believe it if you write it in a pretty essay. I guess I do see value in these sorts of conversations. But even in these sorts of conversations, in these sorts of spaces, I think there is, I don't know, you know, I think there can be a limited utility and limited usefulness. I don't mean to be offensive. It may sound more offensive than I mean, but yeah, I'm not the one. I'm not the person that, I don't put a lot of energy and effort into trying to change the minds or even, to be honest with you, equip folks with those perspectives to shift them or broaden them. I think that's important work. I think there are folks that could offer a better, maybe more direct answer. It ain't me.
Well, I will only add to that it was not the central goal of my writing in the Pines, but I had hoped as a side effect of my deep research and hopefully, you know, poetic language to convince some of the members of my own family. And I will say with all consistency, and I come from one of those families that has people on both sides of America's great political divide, that I have convinced none of them. So I will just second, you know, Brian's not interested in it and I'm a failure, so.
My question kind of builds on what the gentleman was asking a moment ago, and that is that I think we've made a lot of progress with Black Lives Matter and with learning about some of the things in our history that just were erased, like the Black Wall Street in St. Louis and do I have that right? Or is it Little Rock?
Tulsa.
Tulsa. Thank you, thank you. And what happened in Wilmington, North Carolina is something that it was just very upsetting to me. And yet we have people like Governor DeSantis in Florida, who says we can't teach certain things. And he's one of those people with tons of cement to fill in those swimming pools. And it's just so maddening, you know. Today I heard that there's a report that in Alabama, they can't teach anything that has to do with DEI and any kind of diversity. Where do we go when we're moving in two such diametrically opposed directions? It's just so, it's scary to those of us who feel like blacks and whites should be together, that we all put on our pants the same way, that we drink the same water. It's just not, it just doesn't seem like we've made much progress, and I guess that's what's a little frustrating, that fear is still such an amazing motivator for some people, white people I guess mostly, who just don't feel like we are all from the same race, that we're all humans, and the human race is really the catchphrase here.
I would add greed. I think greed is a huge motivator, not just fear. I think greed is a huge part of it. You certainly saw that play out across the South. White people were happy to fund education when they were taking all of the money for their own children and leaving black kids with very little funding. When they had to equally fund education, they sent their kids to bad private schools and cut the budgets, right? So I think greed is a huge motivator. I think we can still teach real history at UVA, at least right this moment. I mean, the Jefferson Council would probably like that to be otherwise, and who knows where we'll go when they appoint 2 more members of the Board of Visitors. But I have faith in our history department and in historians across the campus that we will continue to teach real history. John, do you agree?
Yeah, we shall.
We shall, and I think we just have to fight. And you know, this is going to sound flip, and I don't mean it to, but there's nothing that attracts young people to a topic like it's being forbidden. So I am really hoping this could be the boom times for history, as it has become forbidden to learn real history. It might just, you know, I'm somewhat kidding, but I do think that banning something does make people go, well, what's that about? So maybe we'll see more history majors. But we're going to keep teaching real history at UVA, no matter what the legislature does. at least as long as we're employed. Right, John?
Exactly. Okay, so speaking of employment, then they're never going to allow me to moderate another one of these panels if I don't leave time for the book signing. So I want to give this side of the room one last chance to ask a question because we've been over here for a while. So is there a final question from this side?
Okay, I hope this doesn't come off wrong, but just in my experience with everyday people, not academics, but people on the street and at work and such, the average black and white person, both, do not really care to remember. They would prefer to forget, you know, and I was wondering if you had thoughts on that.
Yeah, maybe it would have been beneficial to hear a little bit more. I think, you know, there's in my first book, I Don't Like the Blues, the name, it's a part of it is a commentary on the relationship that black folks in Mississippi have with a certain style of blues music. Black Mississippians listen to Southern soul blues, not so much Delta style blues, so they're like, I don't like that kind of blues. But then there's another reading where folks do say, why you want to go back to the cotton field? It is a commentary on a hesitance to reflect a lot on difficult times from the past. That don't make me feel good, is kind of the idea. So perhaps I would say that there's, you know, your comment kind of lands a little bit. But I also know that I've talked to hundreds of people. I've talked to literally hundreds of people, literally on the record, audio recorded, transcripts and so forth, where, and sometimes it's even the same folks who say, why you want to go back to the cotton field for? I don't want to remember those things, they make me feel bad, and then they remember. And they talk about how those experiences shape who they are. And they try to impart the lessons that those experiences stirred up in them and left with them. They try to impart those lessons to future generations. So I think I could go on. I don't know if there was another gentleman over here who I saw had his hand up for a while. Okay. So yeah, but I would say, I think there's perhaps there is a hesitance on some parts to reflect on difficult histories, but that's just not really been, it hasn't been my experience.
And I would just second what Brian said with one caveat. I found I've talked to hundreds of people, both in going around and giving talks about this book, but also in doing the research. I did a lot of oral history research. And I found, at least in the rural, small town South, Black people were absolutely ready, although they would say exactly what Brian said, but eventually they would get there and they would talk about the past. I had much more difficulty with white people who know that what they did was wrong. They know it and they don't want to talk about it. And so I had the experience one time of taking my mom back to the town that she's from, and people somehow forgot I was a historian, the white people that she was talking to. I was just driving my mom. They somehow forgot. I wasn't hiding it. I told them I was a historian. And they had a whole different way of talking about everything when they thought they were amongst themselves, if that made sense. And that was very eye-opening to me because I, as a scholar, could not get them really to talk about anything at all. And there's a different way they talk about it when they think it's the inside team. And they also admit in that talking that what they did was wrong, even as they expressed extreme racism. Both of those things went on. So I don't think it's uniformly the case that people aren't interested in the past. I think people who feel like the things that they did are being highlighted as bad in this moment are the ones trying to erase history.
Yeah, I'll jump in too. If you look at the photographs that are behind you and to your side, I curated an exhibition of these photographs by the Halsinger Studio last year at the University of Virginia in the Special Collections Library. And I'm happy to say that that exhibition was the most attended exhibition by far that the Special Collections Library has ever had, and had far more African Americans participating than ever before. You know, it's not that black people aren't eager for history. Maybe, no, we don't really want to talk about lynching all that much. But when you look at the history that's embodied by these splendid photographs and these portraits, and the lives that these people led, because we are able to tell you about the lives that they led, that kind of history people want. In any case, let's thank them. Let's thank them. And the very best way to thank them for being here is to ask them to autograph the book that you've just bought. The books are in this room over here.
They're in this room, to your right.
Oh, there's some books over here too.
Okay.
All right, so who's in charge of the signing?
We'll find them somewhere.
Yellow t-shirt.
Yes.
Where is the book signing? I saw books over here.
The signing's back there. If you'd like to buy a copy, you can buy a copy right out in the lobby here in the concessions, and this book signing will happen back here.
Okay, so buying and signing are two different places. Okay.